Recording on. Good morning, all. Welcome to the Scrutiny Panel for Finance, Performance and Service Improvement. First item on the agenda is apologies for absence. And we have two, and that is Councillor Michael Locke and Councillor Hazel Morris.
Chair, it's Paxton.
Oh, and Paxton Williams. I didn't realise that. Oh, sorry, I do apologise. Hazel Morris is the new councillor, and we've had apologies from Paxton Hood Williams and Councillor Michael Locke. Okay, second item is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interest. First of all, members? No? Officers? No? Okay. Then the third item is the prohibition of votes and declarations of party whips, which is standard. Okay. And then item 4 is the minutes of the previous meeting. Having gone through them, I think they're okay. Anybody else, any comments? No? Okay. Then item 5 is public questions. To my best of my knowledge, we haven't had any. No? Right, then we come on to item 6, which is the role of the performance panel. And I think to some extent, quite a brief outline on it, because the people that are here have actually been on it before, apart from Rachel, who has very scant knowledge of it. So shall we do, I think we'll do Ben Smith first, Finance Director. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Chair. I will endeavour to share my screen, and in similar vein, whilst I'm cranking up the difference engine, can I ask that you can see that? I will so yes, hopefully you can hear me and you can you see what's on screen?
Very clearly, yes.
Excellent. So to some extent, repeating what the chair has said, the reality is many of you know much of this, so I will make sure slides are available at the end, and equally we'll go a little bit off topic because some of the bits are perhaps more pertinent than others in terms of my brief overview of understanding financial reporting. And I think it's particularly pertinent as you see a number of authorities, again, predominantly across the border in England, which are under significant duress, and some of the surprises that then seem to manifest themselves. In terms of my views of the role for scrutiny and the questions that I'd expect you to be asking, are those budget proposals transparent and open enough for people to understand? Would all readers understand? I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek because local government finance is somewhat complicated. I think it's vitally important that the knock-on effects elsewhere or in the future, especially having due regard to the wellbeing of future generations, Act is taken into account. When it comes to considering service budget proposals, the predominant focus from yourselves will be asks of the relevant directors to understand their proposals, but clearly those overall budget strategic matters and technical matters will be matters addressed to me, and part of that scrutiny role and function is to ask, well, what are the alternatives in what are going to be undoubtedly very, very challenging times? In terms of other things that I'm expecting you to put me under the microscope on, are those in-year reports understandable and clear as far as is practically possible, given local government finance is a dark art, as we've consistently said. I think an important one is, are the reports consistent over time? And I have tried to make them as consistent over time as possible, notwithstanding we've had a couple of years of me in jest referring to the budget stuck together with fuzzy felt and Velcro through COVID. And we're clearly going to have very similar issues around some out of shape matters in the national economy and the consequences for the authority. Equally important, are there any surprises at outturn? And one of the things I'm particularly pleased about over the last couple of years, that despite the disruptive effects of COVID and other matters, I don't think there have been any surprises at that outturn point in time. And that is important, that authorities don't suddenly say, well, why didn't anyone tell us what was going on? Equally, when it gets to year end, what is a legitimate and appropriate use of reserves? We've been in the fortunate position of having some very substantial underspends in recent years and being able to beef up those reserves. It then becomes a discussion about what are the appropriate reserves. Clearly, that's a matter for overall allocation of reserves is one for council, but on the advice of cabinet in terms of receiving the outturn. But it is perfectly legitimate for scrutiny to ask what are the alternatives, not only for the here and now, but for what is to come to pass. In terms of my starting presumption around your past behaviours and performances, my presumptions over historic conventions are that you will definitively pre-decision scrutinise all individual budget proposals by directorate during the budget round, and also hold me and a cabinet member for finance to account when you come to look at the budget as a whole. You can, of course, call in any reports at any point in time, but it's likely to remain that they will be by exception only. You are well versed and used to reviewing many of them after they've been to cabinet or council already. So, for example, in the next week or so, the first quarter monitoring report will go to cabinet, and you will look at it after the event rather than before the event, unless there's anything when it's published that makes it super exciting that you wish to call it in advance. But one explicit presumption on my part is that you won't routinely review the statement of accounts, given that that goes to audit committee first and then prior to council, and is subject to a full external audit. I will come back to touch upon some of the individual items in due course, because there are some tensions and pressures that face me as a Section 151 officer, the authority, but also many other authorities around the whole of the UK. In terms of the statement of accounts, I've got to be honest, no one really understands them particularly well. They're very complicated. They're very heavily prescribed as to format and content. I am legally obligated to comply with the code of practice, and to be fair to my external auditor colleagues, they're required to test us against that code of practice. It does mean there are very limited choices over the overall presentation and narrative, and they've grown increasingly complex over the years and longer. They are the one core document that is subject to external audit and certification. They are arguably and inarguably very difficult to understand and very long. And perhaps the most problematical bit at the moment is this was the first year that statutory accounts were meant to be produced by May. We've managed it for several years on the trot. We simply haven't managed it this year, like many other authorities, because of the increasingly complex and increasingly likelihood of disagreements and hold-ups over valuation matters in particular. My institute, which issues the code of practice, has issued a number of emergency technical consultations throughout the year and are still ongoing. There are significant tensions nationally over the valuation of infrastructure assets, the material valuation of housing stock, and we have locally some difficulties still with addressing that final qualification matter from last year. We've worked very closely with audit colleagues to address that matter, but trying to do 20 years worth of catch up on the reserve side on those two statutory reserves, and having a whole raft of entries subject to national hold-ups is making my life somewhat fraught at the technical end of the statement of accounts. I take comfort that I am not alone, and I take comfort from a personal view expressed by the Chief Executive of SIPA, so it's not an institute advice, but that there is a national reputational issue over hold-ups on the accounts and risks of qualifications. Effectively, I read it as a view that don't just take a qualification for the sake of getting the monkey off your back of the statement of accounts signed off. Qualifications are important and signals, and it's equally important to get them right rather than just rush for timeliness. But the longer things drag on, the less useful the statement of accounts is. In one sense, that doesn't matter if you've got robust and fast reporting on the outturn, which is at least something we do retain locally, because my own view is that's the bit that's more important. Local authority accounts are forced to look more and more like the private sector over the years, and it means the same issues and techniques are applied to the valuations on the balance sheet, but in reality, many of the balance sheet items are not so relevant as they would be for a company. But in very uncertain economic times with relatively high inflation, don't forget the external auditor's valuation qualification issue is a disagreement over £10 million. Well, when you've got £2 billion on the balance sheet, 1 or 2% difference on the assets is immediately over that £10 million mark. And that's one of the reasons why we're still in discussions with audit colleagues and why I have not yet been able to present you with a statement of accounts through to council, in case any of you were wondering. In terms of other statutory reports, there are a minimum expected number of reports through each year. I'll come on to list them in a moment. Again, the broad content and expectations are set by professional bodies and regulators when they test, do we have sufficient control mechanisms and open and transparent reporting on the types of reports that ultimately come through to Cabinet or Council. The format and some of the timing is down to local choice, but it's really only at the margin. So there are obligations on me to ensure the level of reserves, to give certifications, to ensure that you clearly understand what are in the reserves reports, some of the statutory setting reports in due course. And you can contrast that with the management information reports. Again, there are some minimum expectations by professional bodies and what's accepted best professional practice around how frequently there is budget monitoring. And again, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But the timing, frequency, style and content is largely down to local choice. And I go back to what I said at the beginning. One of the things I am pleased about is, despite the relative uncertainties of the last 2 years, the current year and what is to come, we have managed to keep the content broadly the same. We have had to inevitably push the timing back a little bit because of uncertainty factors. And as I say, I'll come back to that in a moment when I go through the suite of reports that I consider that you'll be seeing at this panel. In terms of thinking about the life cycle of reports, I could choose any point in time to run through and then roll through. I've chosen to go at the point of pre-budget setting, as it were. So routinely, council will receive my review of reserves, and that is currently scheduled to go to council in October. I think we're ready to roll with that one imminently. It will be an interesting report in the sense it will be uninteresting in terms of the recommendations, in terms of changes to reserves, but an interesting one when you see the level of reserves, because I think the level of reserves are going to be important to try and get us through some of the still washover effects of COVID, but more importantly, the very substantial economic and financial issues that face the country nationally and then manifest themselves in demands, demographic and inflation pressures for individual authorities. The midterm budget statement for the last couple of years has been an oral update, and it is my intention this year to make it a written one, because I think it's important that there is officer advice on the record to council over some very challenging decisions that are likely to need to be taken when it comes to setting next year's budget. The trade-off is it's likely to be pushed back into November, possibly even December, but I hope November, on the basis that I'm waiting for what's been termed a national fiscal event plus an anticipated national budget and some of the consequences that flow from that. But this is a year where I think it is important to return to a formal written statement on the budget, albeit is likely to be littered with a whole raft of things where I'm saying my uncertainties outweigh my certainties again. You can expect a council tax base setting report that comes before the budget and is a very dry and technical report. It is in council's gift to set the tax base, but I am quite clear it is on my professional advice, and probably in reality you have no choice over the advice I give. I mean, I say that with some hesitation, because obviously as an officer I merely advise whole council, but something as technical as the base and the likelihood of people paying. And the reason I emphasise that latter point is I am concerned about people's ability to pay, does ultimately set a tax base that I think is reasonably likely of being collected. And that is important because you'll have seen the budget monitoring for the last couple of years where we have a significant deficit on in-year council tax collection. We've been assisted by Welsh Government over the last couple of years with emergency COVID support. There is no indication that that is going to continue. And then, as I say, the final bit of the sort of pre-budget preamble are draft budget options around the indicative settlement. And again, this is going to be an interesting year because recently we've been getting the settlement as late as the 22nd of December. We do have headline increases for RSG and NNDR for the next 2 years. But there are quite a few variables that may affect the individual authorities' settlements. So I'm still expecting that there will be some draft options around December time, timed with the settlement. If the settlement is late, it may be January. And again, unfortunately, compresses the timescale at the back end. But we will be in the same boat as other authorities. Getting into the sort of meat of the budget setting cycle itself, again, you're all long-serving, long-standing. you will expect to see a medium-term financial plan, which will set out a much more challenging position than was the case even when it was set last year. A budget for both revenue and capital, and for both general fund and housing revenue account, and it will come as no surprise that again they are going to be both much more challenging than what we've had for the last couple of years, notwithstanding the COVID disruption. The economic and financial and public financial circumstances are very, very challenging. That will feed into ultimately council tax setting, and again that's going to be an interesting one. There will be clear officer advice given by myself, as there was last year, and I think there is a growing risk of a tension between officer views as to what is safest to do versus the political lens across the entire political spectrum of what is acceptable and manageable for households that are struggling with the cost of living crisis. But they'll be set out in the normal format, but I do anticipate there is likely to be much more focus on the advice I give, but ultimately the political decisions that will have to be taken by council. And the other items that link to it will be a refresh of the capital strategy, and this is going and the linked treasury management strategy, and both are going to be vitally important for this budget round. We've only just concluded the last term of council, and a clear capital strategy and medium-term financial plan which set out a borrowing envelope, and I got the money away at very, very good rates of interest. We have a new council since May. There will be capital asks falling on the authority across a number of activities, and there will again need to be a policy decision taken ultimately by council when it sets the budget as to the trade-off between revenue and capital spending. And some of that capital spending will require capital borrowing, and the timing of that capital borrowing will be incredibly challenging given that rates have relatively rocketed from the 1-point-something% I was able to get money away from the PWLB before. Timing will be key on that one, but I will be setting out a number of options which will require some capital spending and require a refresh of that treasury management strategy, and I can anticipate it being reviewed in much more detail than a normal year, not just because it's a new term council with a new set of plans, but because of the very uncertain economic outlook that we have, and financing asks which are going to be more challenging than they were previously. In terms of the reporting schedule, you can expect, as before, 3 quarterly budget monitoring reports going through to Cabinet. They are all likely to be at least a month late compared to pre-COVID times. So the first quarter budget monitoring report is going to Cabinet this month. It should be published towards the end of this week. The second quarter is now likely to hit Cabinet in December, and the third quarter in February. So at least Cabinet and ultimately Council are informed when it comes to taking budget decisions. It's not ideal pushing it back a month, but again, with the uncertainties over a number of matters, it's an inevitability. The big spending pressures upon us are the national to be agreed pay award. Last year it wasn't settled until March, right at the year end, which was thoroughly unsatisfactory. Given there is a long process still to be gone, I would not be surprised if we don't know the outcome of whether it's accepted or not, the National Pay Award, until possibly November, more likely December. So again, we'll be at the 3-quarter year spend position, which is unfortunate. We will see in that first quarter budget monitoring report some real pressures upon us in terms of fuel, transport fuel. And whilst we are managing, because we predominantly advance purchase energy, that is going to be an incredibly difficult ask on all authorities, depending on what may be announced in any national fiscal events over the next few days. They're not likely to significantly impact us in the current year, but the increases that we otherwise all face in households and businesses across the land will manifest themselves in future. So there's a trade-off on the timing, and I think that month's delay is worth it to try and get as much as we can in terms of certainty over what are undoubtedly very uncertain times. We get towards year end, you will have an outturn report. The outturn report, I'm pleased that we've got a good track record of getting it out in time, promptly, with quite a degree of accuracy in terms of where it is compared to first, second and third quarter position. It was ready in June, July, but because of June, but because of timing of cabinet, it didn't go until July. But at least we've got certainty over those parts, subject to the statement of accounts being signed off. And at the moment, regrettably, I don't have an end point for the statement of accounts. I'm still in discussions with the auditors, which is not a good place to be, if I'm honest. But as I say, I'm not alone in that in local government terms. So that's the point at which I pause, and will return to the room if I may. Hopefully you can see me back. It was an attempt at a canter through, but recognising that most present, if not all present, are seasoned attendees at this panel. I'm more than happy to take questions. It's been a bit unfortunate in terms of timing that it ends up being this panel only a week before the first quarter, that I haven't got a set of accounts that I can point you to. But I think it is symptomatic, Chair, of where all councils are. And a final plea from me across all scrutiny panels, across the executive, across council, is do not underestimate how utterly fragile and stretched those finance teams are. You can see some of it manifesting in the lateness of reports, the hold-ups in reports. I'm trying to focus on the core stuff, which, if I'm honest, is about cash and financial survivability, but it does mean I'm having to trade off. And at the moment, I'm sitting in some very uncomfortable position with the statement of accounts. But as long as the statement of accounts ultimately is resolved, I will relax from my slight anxiety where we are at the moment, because of course until the accounts are signed off formally, I can't be certain that the outturn position or any previous years is formally correct. I have no concerns on the usable cash positions. The issue is the ongoing tensions around some of those balance sheet asset valuations and that technical matter around those two statutory reserves. So I will pause there to enable you to ask questions of me. I think that summarises the things you would expect. I don't think there are any surprises in there, and hopefully that little bit of context around what is likely to come this year in terms of being challenging will have been of some use. So I will pause there, Chair. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, for a comprehensive overview. Has anybody got any questions? Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, Ben, I think in terms of looking forward now, what work has been done so far in terms of the impact of increased energy costs on the council's budgets, not just the buildings we manage, but schools as well?
Yeah, but it is modelled, Councillor Black, and at the moment there's no formal reporting through on the mechanism. They are dreadful. They are utterly dreadful, as you would expect for every body of our sort of size. I haven't formally reported an item because it's going to partly depend on ultimately what this fiscal national event is and who is or isn't likely to be protected by announcements. The numbers are simply eye-watering. That's all I'm prepared to say at the moment. I don't want to put a number on it, but you can expect it to be very, very significant, both across our estate and across schools. And of course, the issue is when you see the first quarter monitoring report in a week's time going to Cabinet, again, I've got to tread carefully. I can't speak overly about the detail of what's in that in advance, but you should not be surprised that when the first quarter budget monitoring report comes, this authority, like probably every authority in the land, will be saying a budget set with a council tax increase of 1% and inflation sitting at 7%, and now where inflation has got and interest rates have got, it would not be surprising to already be overspent. And therefore our ability locally to provide any support or reassurance at this stage is going to be very, very limited. I liken it to very much being stacked over Heathrow in waiting for a landing pattern. I hope an awful lot of stuff becomes clearer in September. I don't want to give a more specific answer than that, if that's okay, Councillor Black, but you're right to raise it. For the current year, it can be broadly accommodated within the overall position for the authority, much more challenging for schools. And as for next year, at the moment, depending on what this national fiscal event is, all bets are off. I'm afraid I can't be any more specific than that at this stage, but I'm happy to come back in if you've got a follow-up question.
Councillor Jeff Jones.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Ben, you actually ended there with regards to the stresses and strains that your staff are actually under, which is extremely concerning, as it's such an important, part of the authority. is there anything in place to actually make up a shortfall of that staff, and how many staff are we actually talking about, if you're able to say?
Again, I'll be careful in terms of detail, but the stresses and strains are across all functions that I directly manage, but also those that indirectly support me through the service centre. The harsh reality is, as we lose posts through people choosing to go or through illness, it is incredibly challenging at the moment to recruit to posts. It is not easy, and so I have got gaps across fraud team, audit team, core accountancy. Revenues and benefits is holding up relatively well, but the demands upon them show no sign of abating. They're the team that still ends up picking up any national Welsh Government announcements, well-intentioned, around providing additional support to households, and depending on the detail of this national fiscal event, there may well be Welsh Government initiatives that flow from that, and I can expect the team to be asked again to work on that. We got through COVID relatively well, and we managed to keep to producing the accounts on time. Without going into any more detail at this stage, I think you can see it manifesting itself across the piece, in terms of how fragile it is and how already we are late with things that we've never been this late before on. I would emphasise it's not unique to ourselves. I don't think there can be an authority in the land that isn't struggling, and authorities elsewhere, certainly across the border, that are struggling and are then subject to intervention processes. One of the things they're flagging up is, even if there's an intervention process, you've still got to find staff and appropriately qualified staff from somewhere. It is not the most attractive of environments to work in at the moment. I say that personally, I say that professionally, and the same applies to my staff. I would emphasise it's not unique to finance. You know, any scrutiny panel hearing from any of the other chief officers will hear very much the same in the individual fields from other chief officers. It really is difficult, and I would pay testimony to the patience of council and scrutiny and audit committee over the last couple of years. They have been really accommodating of every ask that I've asked of them. But there is no sign of it abating, Councillor Jones, and that's perhaps the unfortunate bit. We went into COVID with a can-do, must-do, Dunkirk type spirit and muddle through, and people are very, very tired, including myself and including colleagues. I can't get away from that. But it's really difficult to recruit to posts. When posts come vacant, we look to fill them, but it seems to take an awfully long time to get even many candidates to apply for roles. It's the most challenging I've known it to be, even compared to just getting through the last couple of years of COVID. We still probably more than many services, other than when it's a difficult one because I say other services, but of course there are still disruptive effects in education and particularly in social services. But of course, many of the COVID washover effects are still around, some of the grant supports. And it's very fraught. I can't really say much more than that. I mean, I just want the committee, and ultimately it'll be viewed by the press, to be aware it is very fragile. It is very stretched across the piece. I don't think you'll be surprised by that. It is the state of local government and public services at the moment, and is indicative of the supply side shortages in the whole economy. We endeavour to patch up when we can, but things are very, very challenging. I can't really say more than that. I'll stop there and hand back to you, Chair.
Yeah, by all means, Jeff.
Sorry, Ben, another question. You actually mentioned about, we were fortunate enough to, shall we say, beef up the reserves, and we seem to be using the capital equalisation as quite a buffer for quite a few things, especially the additional borrowings we've actually made. I know you've actually had shall we say, a good buy in actually reducing the amount we actually expend with, I think you mentioned 1%, the rate you've actually got for borrowings. Now that cushion, as I understand it, will actually cover us up until about, is it 28, 29 or whatever? With regards to this you mentioned anticipated additional borrowing, and these unknowns with regards to extra expense on electricity, gas or whatever, how is that going to affect this buffer as such?
I think that's a very pertinent question, and there are a couple of bits to it. Starting first with the capital equalisation reserve, you were quite right, Councillor Jones. The current trajectory was that it would last to 28-29, but there are items coming through the pipeline that, ahead of any decision by council to commit to future borrowing, I will need to use parts of that capital equalisation reserve if Cabinet is so minded to approve a number of items that are going to come through over the coming months. My intention on future borrowing, subject to any decision by council on the budget in March, and that requires a whole raft of reports to be agreed, will result in me looking for resource cover for the policy trade-off between spending on revenue and capital. But I am very, very unlikely to go out to the money markets or to the PWLB in the short term, given that interest rates have more than doubled on any borrowing that I could reasonably expect to do. Yes, all of the borrowing I've done up to now over the last couple of years was gotten away at 1.something%. It was nearer 2. It was 1.89, 1.92, 1.93, 1.94. But my view was it was a raging certainty and a racing certainty that rates were going to go up. So it was relatively easy to make that call. It's going to be harder to sit on the sidelines, subject to a whole raft of decisions that Cabinet and Council will need to make over the next 6 or 7 months. The wider issue in terms of, yes, the fortuitousness of having very large reserves, we have added to them significantly over the last couple of years, is, you all know it, they can be spent once. And whilst that provides a buffer for the in-year monitoring, the level of concerns around pressures, unless there are very significant consequentials for Wales and very significant consequentials to future local government finance settlements for authorities in Wales, the reserves provide some buffer, but they are not a panacea for the sheer scale of the base pressures to come. That's not going to be unique to this authority. All authorities are going to be in that position, and I don't think any authority in Wales has yet reported its first quarter monitoring position. I would be surprised if there isn't an authority that doesn't say it is overspending and is likely to need to use reserves in the short term, and will be waiting with bated breath to see what happens on this national fiscal event. It is compounded by what we already know. In council, I gave clear advice and members recognised it through the scrutiny and budget setting process. The settlement was fully front loaded, a 9% increase in revenue support grant for this year. I refer to the advice I gave, which in nominal terms phenomenal, in real terms somewhat surreal. I'd now say in real terms utterly surreal. And of course, the problem going forward is you've got built-in settlement assumptions of 3% and 2% for following years, when inflation could be, take your pick, 10, 15, 18, 20, 25%. It is really, really frightening times. So it's a pertinent question to ask Councillor Jones. The position is we're okay and better than most in the short term, but there won't be an authority in the land in Wales or England that isn't under pressure. And from my reading of the professional press, there are a number of slightly larger authorities than ourselves, but some of those large metropolitan areas outside cities and a number of the county councils in England. I've seen 5 or 6 reports already of authorities slightly bigger than us, but not tiddlers, reporting in-year overspends of £20 million in excess of their available reserves, and forecasting gaps of 70, 80 million pounds for next year alone. As I say, I won't be drawn on our own figures at the moment because ours aren't in the public domain, but I think you're going to see a slew of these across authorities. And it will be interesting to see where all authorities in Wales are. We are in a relatively fortunate position that most authorities in Wales, if not all authorities, added to their reserves during COVID. But you all know the mantra, reserves can be spent once. They do not address any of the base budget pressures. And without going into the detail of what report will go to Cabinet in the middle of the month, I will be making those points very clear to Cabinet and to the wider councillors. It is very, very challenging times at the moment.
Thank you.
Councillor Black.
Yeah, clearly, Ben, the current amount of money we borrowed and we owe is on fixed rates, so the rising interest rates are not going to impact on that. But I know there are a number of Cabinet reports coming forward with future borrowing requirements. I think this Thursday there's some there as well, and also when we manage the money, we put money out and take it in. There's interest rates involved there. So is there going to be a big impact in future borrowing in terms of the rising interest rates? And it looks like it's going to keep on going up, to be honest.
Yeah, there is and there isn't short term. I mean, it's a horrible thing to think about, but to some extent, short term, next couple of years, I think you're right, Councillor Black, interest rates look like they're only going to go one way. It will very much depend on what happens after that in terms of the expectation of a full-blown recession. We'll have to see what transpires. I'm not convinced interest rates will stay high for the whole of the next 5-year period. And one of the things that we do have some flexibility on is the timing at which we actually go and borrow more cash. The exempt items coming through to Cabinet this week and future items coming through, which will inevitably commit to future borrowing, do put a burden on the authority, and perhaps a disproportionately harder burden than we've had in the past, because interest rates have already near doubled for us in terms of borrowing from the PWLB. And indeed, I will continue to look to use capital equalisation reserve in the short term to buy as much time as possible. It's going to be about timing the markets again, in terms of when we actually go and physically borrow the cash. The advice I'm giving, which will be in camera to Cabinet for the commercially sensitive items on Thursday, will be along those lines, which is I am looking for resource cover, because effectively Cabinet this cycle and in future cycles, as well as Council when it comes through to March, will be making some fairly fundamental policy trade-offs between the amount to prioritise to capital versus revenue. And it is unequivocally the case that I would expect for several years that cost of financing any capital to be materially harder and higher than what we've done in the past. So it is going to make it much more challenging, but my current intent is to not physically borrow the cash until I hope interest rates start on a downward trajectory again. It's always dangerous trying to time markets. We got lucky previously. I hope to get lucky again, but of course that hope in terms of luckiness only comes if other parts of the economy do particularly badly, and that may itself have direct consequences on the overall public finances. So it's going to be really, really challenging. As I say, without going into the detail of the advice I've given in the end camera reports, there is a reason and rationale for the wording I've given in those reports, as I'm sure you'll have read them, Councillor Black, and worked out exactly the points I'm making, and I understand why you've raised those points. It is going to be really, really difficult. Yes, the money that's been borrowed from the PWLB is safe and locked in at those rates. It is much harder to finance future capital borrowing, and I think one of the inevitable consequences is there is an acceptance that it will have to be a smaller amount of borrowing, quite simply because it is so much more expensive than it was previously to get away. But I'm still thinking about it over that sort of 5-year medium-term plan. That sort of gets us to the point of the answer I gave to Councillor Jones previously around capital equalisation reserve was forecast to last through to 28-29. Again, without overly revealing the advice I'm giving in camera to Cabinet on Thursday, clearly in the short term, if I'm not going out and borrowing from the PWLB, I am depleting reserves, and for the capital spend, I am depleting the capital equalisation reserve, which is finite at the moment in terms of amount. But I'm using that muscle to try and buy as much time as possible. Whether it lasts long enough for market rates to turn around, time will tell. But I think they're very pertinent points and ones that will continue to weigh heavily on the officer advice I give, but equally accepting that there are a whole raft of things that Council legitimately will want to take forward. The reality is bids for the levelling up funds require match funding and will require councils to borrow. And I've just there isn't a council in the land that is likely to say it's not overspent already in the current year, but I bet there isn't a council in the land that isn't bidding for some levelling up fund money, because there are sums to go after. But it's not the most efficient use of reserves. It's more efficient to fund capital through borrowing than spend reserves in their entirety. But it does provide some timing for us. That's a very long answer. Apologies if I've rambled on too long on that one, Councillor Black. I'll call it there, Chair, on that one, unless there's a follow-up question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the other drivers is the weak pound, which is going to drive the interest rates up, but also going to have an impact on the capital programme in terms of materials coming abroad. So that's going to drive up costs as well. So I think in terms of the capital programme, you would think that's fairly steady, but it does look to me like we're going to have overspends on that as well as a result of that, which is going to add to the pressures.
I would concur. There is an inevitability of inflationary pressures on imports. And there are in-year pressures already on the capital programme. It's not just new plans and new pots of money to bid for, which require some match funding. There will undoubtedly be significant inflationary pressures on the existing capital programme. I concur entirely with that statement, Councillor Black.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, thanks, Ben. The only thing I would ask is that there's obviously between audit and this panel, there are quite a lot of reports that come up. And I think one of the things that I've spoken to Richard about, and the chair of audit, is that we try our best not to overlap too much, so that, you know, both this panel and the audit panel have their roles to play. And I hope that we can sit down at some stage and make sure that we don't overlap or put more pressure on the finance department or other departments to do that. Obviously, one of the reasons that we borrow is for projects. We do not borrow for the sake of borrowing. So obviously, you mentioned there's a couple of items coming up in the various budget cabinet reports, etc. And I'm assuming there are more of the reports coming up later on with other projects in it. The one thing I would ask you to do, obviously, because you can't got the outturn at the moment, the one thing you can say is how much we've actually paid back this year at the end of this last financial year, how much we paid back and how much headroom there is in the current borrowing system. In other words, if we've paid back, say, 30 million, can we borrow 30 million without affecting our total borrowing requirement? It will affect the repayment, but the borrowing requirement, obviously we can't have that answer yet, but I look forward to seeing you at the outturn when you can do that. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Ben, for your very, very comprehensive report.
Thank you, Chair.
The next item on the agenda is the overview and understanding of performance monitoring. And we have Mr. Richard Rowland, Strategic Development and Performance Manager, to give us a brief outline on this. Richard, how are you this morning?
Very good. Thank you, Chair. Yourself?
All right. I hope you enjoyed that overview by Ben. I thought you completely understood every bit of it, didn't you? Like the rest of us. Ben, over to you. Sorry, Richard, over to you. Obviously, a lot of the members that are here are quite concerned about the performance monitoring, but we also understand there's been some changes once again in the way in which this has been compiled. So over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Council's performance management arrangements. And I hope that at the end of it, you'll be familiar with the arrangements and have a broad overview of how they operate within Swansea. And as you say, you're all pretty much aware of them. So I thought I'd talk today more about the background, really. So there are two key pieces of legislation that govern performance across all councils in Wales. We have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and more recently we have Part 6 of the Local Government and Elections Act 2021. And like in Ben's area, both pieces of legislation are a little complicated, and I guess it'd be fair to say cryptic as well. But I'll do my best to try and explain them. So firstly, the Future Generations Act. All councils in Wales have to set what are called wellbeing objectives. And the aim of the wellbeing objectives is that we maximise our contribution to the 7 national goals which were established by the Act. And you can see these in the first table in the slide. And then these wellbeing objectives that we set are also our key priorities. So they're expressed within our corporate plan. And then when we're working to meet our wellbeing objectives, then we have to do so in a sustainable way, which means in the context of this Act, applying what are called the 5 ways of working, which you can see in the second box here. So that really means looking to the long term, looking to long-term challenges or trends, trying to prevent problems from happening or from getting worse, trying to integrate things or join things up, and so by doing that, avoid duplication or having conflicting priorities, involving people in what we do, so the public or service users or stakeholders, and then lastly, working in partnership and collaborating with other organisations. And all councils in Wales then have to publish an annual wellbeing report where we detail the progress that we've made and our performance in terms of meeting those wellbeing objectives that we've set to meet the national goals. And then, as I said earlier, more recently, we have Part 6 of the Local Government and Elections Act. And what that does is introduce 5 new statutory duties on performance in local authorities in Wales. So the first duty that we have now is to keep our performance under review. So what that means is threefold. So firstly, looking at how effectively we're delivering our functions. So how well are we doing things? And within the context of the Future Generations Act, that means how well are we delivering our wellbeing objectives. Then we have to assess and report on how well we're using our resources and providing value for money, but in doing so in an equitable and sustainable way. And then lastly, the extent to which our governance is effective in supporting our ability to deliver our functions effectively and use our resources effectively. We also have a duty to undertake a self-assessment on this and then publish the self-assessment in an annual self-assessment report. So we have 2 duties, an annual wellbeing report and also an annual self-assessment report under this piece of legislation. We also have to consult the public each year on our performance and be subjected to an externally led panel performance assessment, very much like a peer review, which has to be done once every 4 years. So our performance arrangements tries to pull all of this together, synthesize it and make sense of it. And we do this through 2 routes. So we've got 1 route on the left-hand side and 1 route on the right-hand side. So firstly, on the left-hand side, this is where we assess how effectively we're delivering our functions by reviewing how well we are meeting our wellbeing objectives set out in the corporate plan. And we do this through our quarterly and annual performance monitoring reports, and also through the completion now of a self-reflection tool at the second quarter and at the end of the year. Then on the right-hand side here, we assess our effective use of resources and our governance arrangements. And then some of this information is used for the annual governance statement. But all of the information through this process ends up through our what we call the annual review of performance. And this is where we meet those two duties to produce an annual wellbeing report and the annual self-assessment. So those two duties which are set out in those two pieces of legislation which I just described. Assurance then is provided internally and externally in a number of different ways. So CMT, Cabinet and this Scrutiny Performance Panel all review our quarterly and annual performance monitoring reports and also our annual review of performance. And the annual review of performance is also reviewed by the Governance and Audit Committee and will also be assessed by the external performance panel. So this is an extract from our quarterly and annual performance monitoring reports. This particular one is from the 2020-2021 annual performance monitoring report. You are all familiar with this, so I'll just go through it very, very briefly. So at the top here on the left-hand side, we have the performance indicator and we have a reference number, so AS10 in this instance, and we have a little arrow at the top. That's the direction of travel arrow. So if it's pointing up, it means that the result, if it's high, it's good. And if the arrow is pointing down, it means that if the result is low, then that is good. We then have the description of the performance indicator. And then underneath we have a graph. And you can see that the graph covers 4 financial years. And it's broken down into each of the quarters. And you've got the percentage result on the left-hand side. And what that allows us to do is just to see what the trend has been over the previous years. So you can see in this particular instance in 2019-20, performance improved each quarter, and then over 2020-2021, we gave it all straight back. On the key here, going down on the column, we've got the RAG status, or the red, amber, green status, which I'll talk about in a little. And what we do is that we read down and then read across. So we have the result, then we have the target that's been set for this particular indicator. We have the trend, whether it's improving, declining, or remaining static. And then if it's a percentage result, we have the numerator figure and the denominator figure, so the two figures which make up the percentage result. So if you look at this instance, we can see that in 2018-19, the result was green, and it was green in 2019-20. It was blank in 2020-21, which I'll explain in a little while. And the green result is based upon the result versus the target. So we can see that in 2018-19, the result was 71.05% and the target was 70%. So the result exceeded the target and therefore the result is green. And if we look at 2019-20, we can see that we've got a decline in trend in terms of performance. And that's because if you compare the 2019-20 result of 70.58% with the 2018-19 result of 71.05%, you can see that there was a drop in performance, so it's been noted as declining. The reason why we have blank RAG status is because we didn't set a target in 2020-2021 because of the COVID pandemic. No targets were set during the course of the pandemic, but we did retain the comparison of performance to the previous period. So you can see that in 2020-2021, the result was 67.08%, which was less than the result in 2019-20. And so we have a decline in trend. And then lastly, we have the comment. And so we ask officers to put a comment in there just to put the data, the latest result, and some of the trends into their broader context. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions? Councillor Jeff Jones?
Yeah, quite interested in this, Richard. You know, when you're actually talking about performance reports and targets, and this is a national, shall we say, system, we're talking about Wales here, which has been set by the Welsh Government. It must be a standardised target and a standardised assessment of how you perform. Is that correct? And do we measure ourselves against other authorities? Because otherwise, how are you going to measure something if you've got different targets and different measurements? I don't know if you can answer that.
Yeah, so the only thing that's consistent is the legislative context in which we all work. So as I described earlier, we all have to set our well-being objectives. We all have to establish steps to deliver those well-being objectives. And then we have to assess ourselves against, how successful we've been in terms of doing that. One of the ways in which we try to make that judgment is on the basis of our performance monitoring reports. Now, it used to be the case that we had a national performance measurement framework. So there were a set of national performance indicators, that every council in Wales had to report on. And, we could compare ourselves with other local authorities in Wales. So that was sometimes difficult because it is quite challenging to find, a similar local authority in terms of how you can actually compare performance in a meaningful way. But we did have that mechanism. Unfortunately, over the years, the national performance framework was reduced somewhat, and it's now to the point where there is no national performance framework in terms of measurement. There are within individual service areas. So, for example, social services has a national performance measurement framework. So there is a set of indicators there that can be compared across different local authorities in Wales, but it is very much on a service by service basis. There is no national corporate framework as such. The Data Cymru unit is currently looking at this particular issue because under the Local Government and Elections Act 2021, there is within the statutory guidance guidance in there about comparing ourselves nationally, but that is very difficult to do if we don't have a set of national measures. So the data unit are at the moment working with local authorities across Wales to see if they can find a new framework to try and plug that gap. But it won't be a framework that will be publicly reported. It wouldn't necessarily, there would be no compulsion to publicly report it. It'll be purely used for our self-assessment reports under the Local Government Elections Act. Although if we include those indicators within our reports, then obviously they will be public. But that comparison, hopefully there will be a system in place going forward that will allow us to make some comparisons. And then, that will obviously improve the context in which we're reporting our results.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Otherwise, somebody could actually say they've achieved, and somebody else said they didn't achieve. Who actually monitors this at the end of the day? Who actually audits it? And is the Welsh government actually included in this process as well? Do they monitor themselves?
So in terms of the annual reports that we have to publish, so our annual review of performance, which will then meet the duty to produce an annual wellbeing report and an annual self-assessment, they're not audited as such by Audit Wales. Under the previous arrangements, under the Local Government Measure 2009, when we produced our annual report, that was audited. But the only requirement under the new pieces of legislation is that Audit Wales have to review the arrangements that we've put in place to produce the reports. So they have reviewed the arrangements within Swansea, and they've given a satisfactory report on that, and that will be included in a letter which will be sent to the local authority in the near future. Other than that, the reports that we produce, the quarterly monitoring reports, as I mentioned in the presentation, they come through, to Cabinet and then through to this scrutiny panel for you to review. And the annual review performance, that annual report which meets the two duties that we now have under these two pieces of legislation, that will also come to this panel, and that will also go to the Governance and Audit Committee for them to review as well. And as I mentioned, we have an externally led panel once every 4 years. And what they will do is that they will also assess the arrangements that we've put in place to produce our self-assessments and performance reports, but they will also make their own judgment as well in terms of how we're performing and how we're meeting those duties.
Okay, Jeff?
Yeah,
Peter,
thank you.
No, anyone else? Linda, is she there? No. Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Just very briefly, the when you do the presentations, obviously, if people have questions about any particular item, it's a matter of feedback to that department, and then feedback to us as a scrutiny panel, and as opposed to you giving a report on that particular day. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for your presentation. And I know that we look forward to the next one, which is in October. Okay. Thank you,
Chair.
Richard.
Thank
Bye.
you, Chair.